It was autumn, 1983. The air in the bunker was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, ozone from the humming electronics, and the faint, sharp tang of floor wax. This was Rivne, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, headquarters of the Carpathian Military District. Outside, the forests were a blaze of gold and crimson. Inside, under tons of reinforced concrete, the maps were stained a single, terrifying color: NATO blue. General Lieutenant Viktor Malinsky, Chief of District Intelligence, stared at the reconnaissance photograph on the light table. The grain of the film was thick, the image captured by a high-altitude MiG-25R aircraft just 2 days prior. The location: a staging area in West Germany, near the Fulda Gap. The subject: an American M1 Abrams tank, parked neatly in a row with 17 others. Malinsky rubbed the bridge of his nose, his eyes burning. It was not the tank itself that bothered him. His analysts had been studying the M1 Abrams vehicle for years, its composite armor, its powerful gas turbine engine, its formidable 105mm cannon. They had plans for that. What bothered him was the location. And the date. "The unit designation?" he asked, his voice a low growl. A young GRU colonel, pale and sweating slightly despite the bunker's chill, cleared his throat. "Comrade General, photographic analysis confirms. 3rd Brigade, 2nd Armored Division, hell on wheels." Malinsky went very still. The other officers in the room exchanged nervous glances. "That," Malinsky said, tapping the photo, "is impossible." The colonel swallowed. "Sir, the markings are clear." "The markings may be clear, but the facts are not," Malinsky retorted. He walked over to a vast map of the North Atlantic. On it, a series of small red flags tracked the progress of a NATO convoy. The 3rd Brigade, 2nd Armored Division, is based at Fort Hood, Texas. Correct? "Correct, Comrade General. And its heavy equipment is scheduled to arrive by sea at the port of Bremerhaven. He squinted at the board. 6 more days, correct? "Correct, Comrade General." "Then explain to me," Malinsky said, turning back to the young officer, his voice dangerously soft, "how its tanks are already on maneuvers in the Fulda Gap. Explain to me how this brigade, which is still supposedly in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, is preparing to blunt our glorious tank armies." The room was silent. There was no explanation. This was not a minor discrepancy. This was a fundamental breakdown in reality. The Soviet Union's entire plan for the defense of the homeland, a plan which, paradoxically, involved a 7-day armored blitzkrieg to the Rhine River, was predicated on a single unshakable fact: logistics. Warsaw Pact doctrine was built on speed and mass. They would overwhelm NATO before the Americans could reinforce. Soviet intelligence tracked the return of forces to Germany program Reforger with religious fanaticism. They knew, down to the last shipping container, how long it took the United States to move its heavy divisions from North America to the European front. It was a matter of weeks. Weeks they would not have. But this photograph spat in the face of their mathematics. It suggested the Americans had found a way to bend time and space. "It is a deception," a political officer from the main political directorate offered, his voice oily. "They are using inflatable decoys, a classic maskirovka to frighten us." Malinsky shot him a look of pure contempt. "Inflatable decoys do not leave 30-centimeter deep track marks in wet soil. Look," he said, pointing to another photo. "This is a thermal image. The engines are hot. These are real. They are manned, and they are here." The general's mind raced. He picked up a red pencil and walked to his own private map. If the 2nd Armored Division was here now, not in 6 days, what else was here? He began to make new marks on the acetate overlay, his hand moving with jerky, angry strokes. The meticulous, comforting arithmetic of the correlation of forces was dissolving before his eyes. "It must be the Pomkus sites," the colonel suggested, grasping for a rational answer. "Pre-positioned organizational material configured to unit sets. They have the tanks hidden in climate-controlled warehouses in Germany. The troops were flown in and simply unlocked them." Malinsky considered this. It was true, the Americans had such sites. "The 3rd Brigade, 2nd Armored, their Pomkus set is in Mönchengladbach," he muttered, thinking aloud. "It is possible. But the volume. PARP satellite reconnaissance has shown no unusual activity at that site. No mass troop movements. And this is not the only report." He gestured to a stack of flimsy teletype papers on his desk. 2 days ago, 8th Guards Army reported a full battalion of M2 Bradley vehicles in the Bavarian forest. Unit designation, 1st Infantry Division. That division is also, supposedly, still at sea. The numbers are wrong. The math is broken. This was the true incident. It wasn't a single dramatic explosion. It was a creeping, terrifying anomaly in the data. It was the logistical equivalent of a ghost story. The Americans were conjuring phantom armies. To the men in that bunker, this was more frightening than any new missile or stealth bomber. A stealth bomber could be shot down. A missile could be intercepted. But how do you fight an enemy who can teleport an entire armored division across an ocean? How do you stop an invasion when the enemy's reinforcements arrive before the war even begins? This phantom capability, this logistical ghost, threatened the very foundation of Soviet military power. It meant their massive tank armies, poised to strike, were already outflanked. It meant the carefully constructed timetables for victory were nothing but fantasy. This is the kind of mystery that keeps generals awake at night, the kind of imbalance that loses wars before the first shot is ever fired. Here at Cold War Impact, we peel back the layers of these historical mysteries, not just to tell you what happened, but to show you why it mattered. If you want to understand the true weapons of the Cold War, the strategies, the deceptions, and the technologies that defined an era, subscribe to the channel and join our analysis. The investigation began immediately, and it was poisoned from the start by paranoia and disbelief. The GRU's Line X, responsible for acquiring foreign science and technology, was given a priority directive: identify the Americans' method of rapid, undeclared heavy reinforcement. But where were they to look? They tapped agents in the port of Bremerhaven. The agents reported normal activity. The ships were arriving, but the tanks were already in the field. They tasked spies within NATO command. The spies reported on exercise plans that seemed to defy their own logistical constraints. They simply list the units as arrived, one frantic report read. There is no mention of the transport mechanism. It is assumed. They turned their electronic intercept satellites, their trawlers, in the North Atlantic to listen for. What? A new kind of signal? A massive, unknown transport? All they heard was the routine chatter of the US Air Force's Military Airlift Command, mostly C-141 Starlifter aircraft, a capable transport, to be sure, but one that could barely carry a single older Misicenta tank, and certainly not the new 60-plus ton M1 Abrams. The Soviet military attaché in Washington, D.C., a grim, observant GRU colonel named Andrei Fomin, was ordered to attend the Andrews Air Force Base airshow. He stood in the humid 1983 summer heat, watching the American displays of power. The Thunderbirds, the F-15 Eagle fighter, the B-52 bomber. And then he saw it. It was grotesque. An absurdly large, pregnant-looking aircraft, with a high tail and a wing that seemed to droop under its own impossible weight. The announcer called it the C-5 Galaxy. Fomin had seen pictures of it, of course. His files in Moscow were full of them, but to see it in person was different. It didn't look like it could fly. It looked like a building that had been given wings as a cruel joke. He watched it perform a low pass, its 4 massive engines emitting a strange, low-pitched howl, unlike the piercing scream of his own military's jets. He saw it land, its complex 28-wheel landing gear absorbing the immense impact. He even watched with detached curiosity as the entire front of the aircraft, the nose cone and cockpit, hinged upwards, like a great beast opening its maw. He dutifully wrote his report. The C-5 Galaxy transport was displayed. It is monstrous in size. The Americans claim it can carry any piece of equipment in their army's inventory. This is clearly an exaggeration meant for domestic propaganda. Its maintenance record is known to be poor, and its operational readiness is questionable. It is a symbol of capitalist excess, not a practical weapon. His superiors in Moscow read the report and filed it away. They already knew about the C-5. They had known about it since the late 1960s, and they had dismissed it. Their own engineers, the brilliant minds at the Antonov and Tupolev design bureaus, had looked at the C-5's specifications when they first emerged and declared them to be a fantasy. A plane that opened at both ends, a visored nose and an aft ramp, a landing gear that could kneel like a camel, a wing that suffered from premature fatigue. It was an engineer's nightmare. It was too complex, too expensive, too unreliable. The Soviets built their transports like their tanks, simple, rugged, and easy to produce in mass. The N-22 Cock was a masterpiece of brute force practicality. The Americans, they concluded, had built a hangar queen. A plane so complex it spent more time being repaired than flying. This belief, this core assumption, was the foundation of their blindness. Therefore, this phantom logistical capability could not be the C-5. The C-5 fleet was too small, too broken, too unreliable. The answer had to lie elsewhere. The mystery remained. Malinsky's ghost armies continued to haunt the Fulda Gap, and the real source of the terror was hiding in plain sight, dismissed as a piece of over-budgeted, over-engineered American propaganda. The Soviets were looking for a secret. They were looking for a conspiracy. They were looking for a ghost. They should have been looking at a cargo plane. The directive from Moscow landed on General Lieutenant Malinsky's desk with the subtlety of a mortar round. It was stamped Osobaya Papka, special file. This meant it came from the very top, bypassing the usual chain of command, and that failure to resolve it would be personally, and perhaps terminally, costly. The mystery of the Phantom Armies was no longer an anomaly. It was a crisis at the Politburo level. The full, paranoid might of the Soviet intelligence apparatus was mobilized. It was a three-pronged attack, and every prong was aimed in the wrong direction. First, the GRU's 6th Directorate Signals Intelligence, or SIGINT, was ordered to find the command signal. If the Americans were moving vast new assets, they must be coordinating it. The vast Lourdes listening station in Cuba, the largest of its kind in the world, was retasked. Analysts who had spent their careers listening to Strategic Air Command bomber traffic were now ordered to find the digital fingerprints of this new logistical capability. They sifted through petabytes of data, through microwave relays, satellite uplinks, and tactical radio chatter. They found nothing. They found the routine, high-volume traffic of the Military Airlift Command, or MAC. They logged hundreds of C-140, one Starlifter, and C-5 Galaxy flights. But the analysts, steeped in their own doctrine of maskirovka and deception, refused to believe the evidence. The Americans would never be so obvious. This C-5 traffic, they concluded, was a spoof. It was a massive-scale deception to cover up the real transport method. Whatever it was, every C-5 flight they logged was, in their minds, proof that the real secret lay elsewhere. Second, the KGB's Line R, under the First Chief Directorate, was activated. Line R was not for normal intelligence gathering. It was for analyzing data to predict and prevent a surprise nuclear attack. The presence of phantom divisions, capable of appearing overnight, was treated as exactly that, a prelude to war. Line R analysts, working in their sterile offices at Yasenivo, began to build complex, terrifying models. They seized on the Pomkas theory that Malinsky's staff had initially considered. The Americans must have a new, secret network of these pre-positioned warehouses. They weren't at the known sites like Mönchengladbach. They were hidden, but where? This sparked a massive, wasteful hunt. Cosmos spy satellites were moved out of their normal orbits to begin painstaking, high-resolution photography of every square kilometer of forest, every abandoned mine, every large industrial park within 300 kilometers of the East German border. Spetsnaz teams were infiltrated, not to sabotage, but just to look. They were tasked with finding large, newly constructed buildings with high-security perimeters and no obvious purpose. They found dozens. They were invariably distribution centers for German corporations, new bottling plants, or NATO maintenance depots for conventional ammunition. The secret Pomkas sites did not exist. The third prong of the investigation was the most desperate: the Soviet Naval Intelligence Directorate. If the tanks were not coming by air, and not already in place, they must be coming by sea, but in a new, clandestine way. The theory of the seafloor cache took hold. It was absurd, but it was the only one that fit the broken data. The main underwater sabotage directorate, the Frogmen, were consulted. Could it be done? Yes, they reported it was theoretically possible. And so, Soviet attack submarines, Victor-class and Alpha-class boats, were pulled from their patrols of NATO's nuclear submarine bastions. They were sent on black operations to painstakingly map the seabed off the coasts of Bremerhaven and Rotterdam, hunting for the magnetic anomalies of massive, hidden steel containers. They found 20th century shipwrecks. They found undersea cables. They found nothing. While the state's intelligence arms chased ghosts, the legend was being built in the field. It was built from the fragmented, terrified reports of men who saw things they could not explain. In a GRU safehouse in Bonn, a panicked East German agent, a sleeper, who worked as a maintenance foreman on a Bundesbahn railway line, was debriefed. "I tell you, they were Mu-1 tanks," he whispered, his hands shaking as he smoked the unfiltered Soviet cigarettes his handler provided. A full train of them, 60 flatbeds. They came from the direction of the Ramstein airbase. Airbase, not the port. His handler, a seasoned case officer, internally dismissed the report. The man was a train mechanic, not an armor expert. He must have mistaken them for M60 tanks. The report was filed as unconfirmed, likely misidentification. In the skies over the Baltic, a pair of Su-15 flag-on interceptors was scrambled from Kaliningrad. Their target, a large, slow-moving contact that had strayed from an established air corridor. The lead pilot, Major Dmitry Volkov, was a veteran. He approached the contact, his weapons systems hot. "Contact is visual," he reported, his voice flat with confusion. "It is one aircraft, American, C-5. It is enormous. It is unarmed, requesting instructions." His ground controller, his voice tight with suspicion, ordered, "Force it to land now!" Volkov sighed. He pulled his Su-15 alongside the cockpit of the American transport. The plane was so large it felt like he was flying next to an apartment building. He could clearly see the American pilots inside, one of whom looked over, waved, and then gestured rudely with his middle finger. "Comrade, they are non-compliant," Volkov reported. "They are, waving. The aircraft is proceeding on its original course. I am not detecting any threat." He was ordered to stand down, to escort the C-5 until it left their air defense identification zone. When he landed, he was subjected to a 4-hour debriefing. What did he really see? What was its true engine signature? Was it really a C readout? Or was it a new class of strategic bomber disguised as a transport? Volkov was baffled. "It was a cargo plane," he insisted. "A very, very big cargo plane." His testimony only deepened the mystery. The Americans were now, his commanders believed, so arrogant they were flying their phantom transports right past Soviet airspace, knowing they were untouchable. The Soviet high command was now hopelessly lost, trapped in a maze of their own creation. Their most brilliant analysts had developed 3 competing and utterly wrong conclusions. The first was the kit theory. The Americans were using their C-141 Starlifter fleet, which the Soviets respected, to fly the M1 tanks over in pieces. They would fly the turret in one plane, the chassis in another, the engine in a third. Then, these kits were being assembled in secret, underground factories near the front. This was a logical, industrial, and profoundly Soviet way of thinking. It was also completely wrong. The second was the airship theory. A handful of grainy, high-altitude satellite photos from the 1970s showing experimental American heavy-lift airship prototypes were suddenly dredged up by Line R. This, they argued, was the real secret. The Americans had perfected a fleet of massive, radar-invisible airships. They were moving the tanks at night, at low altitude, silently. This explained why SIGINT heard nothing and why fighter pilots saw nothing. The third, and most terrifying, was the combined theory. The Phantom armies were already in Europe, hidden in the non-existent Pomkus sites, and the C-5 traffic was a feint. The reports from agents like the train mechanic were a provocation, a form of psychological warfare to make the Soviets think they had a new transport capability. The goal was to trick the USSR into a new, impossibly expensive arms race to build their own fleet of super transports, thereby bankrupting the Soviet economy. The irony was agonizing. The Soviets had tied themselves in intellectual knots, inventing conspiracies of vast secret factories, fleets of silent zeppelins, and deep-sea caches. They were desperately trying to explain a capability that was being openly displayed, and had been for over a decade. They were hunting for a ghost, while the monster itself was waving at them from 30,000 feet. While Soviet intelligence chased phantoms across the seabed and hunted for imaginary zeppelins, the answer to the mystery was sitting on a sun-baked tarmac in Marietta, Georgia. It was not a secret. It was simply unbelievable. The solution was born not in the 1980s, but 2 decades earlier, in the smoke-filled offices of the Pentagon during the Kennedy administration. The problem was not Soviet, it was American. and the problem was time. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the United States military was a strategic giant, chained to a logistical ball. The new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was the bulwark against a Soviet land invasion of Europe. The American plan was simple: hold the line with the forces already in Germany, while a massive iron mountain of steel tanks, artillery, and divisions was loaded onto ships in Charleston and New York and steamed across the Atlantic. This plan had a fatal flaw. The ships were slow. The process would take weeks, perhaps more than a month. Soviet war doctrine, conversely, was built on a single apocalyptic word: tempo. Their plan was to win the war in 7 days. By the time the American cavalry arrived, the Red Banner would be flying over Paris. General Curtis LeMay, the notoriously aggressive Chief of Staff of the Air Force, knew this. The existing transport fleet, primarily the C-130 Hercules and the new C-141 Starlifter, was a revolution. The C-141 could move an entire company of men. It could even, with great effort, carry a single, lighter M60 tank, though this was not its primary design. It was not enough. It was fast, but it didn't solve the heavy problem. The army was getting heavier. The new M1 Abrams tank, then just a concept on paper, would be a 60-ton monster. In 1963, the Air Force issued a requirement. It was designated Cargo Experimental Heavy Logistics System, or CXHLS. The document that landed on the desks of America's aviation giants Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed was not an incremental request. It was a demand for a fantasy. The Air Force, under the guidance of visionaries in the Military Airlift Command, demanded a flying machine that could carry any piece of equipment in the United States Army's arsenal. Not just troops, not just jeeps, everything. They wanted to be able to lift a 2.5-ton truck, a 100,000-pound M60 Patton tank, or a massive Chinook helicopter, and fly it over 6,000 nautical miles. But the most revolutionary demand was not in the weight. It was in the dimensions. The cargo bay, the requirement stated, must be over 120 feet long, 19 feet wide, and 13.5 feet high. Why these specific colossal numbers? Because an engineer at Lockheed, Georgia, had sat down with his counterparts at the Army's Tank Automotive and Armaments Command. They didn't just look at the current M60 tank. They looked at the future, and they realized that a cargo bay of this precise size could carry not one, but two of the Army's new 55-ton main battle tanks. This was the genesis of the mystery. The C-5 Galaxy was not just a plane, it was a unit-set mover. It was designed from its inception to move an entire combat-ready armored company, its 6 M1 tanks, its Bradley fighting vehicles, its support trucks, and its helicopters across the Atlantic in hours, not weeks. The Soviets, in their analyses, saw the C-5's technical specifications as flaws. They were, in fact, the entire point. Soviet intelligence, as Colonel Fomin had reported, sneered at the visored nose. A giant, upward hinging door that included the cockpit. It was an absurd structural weakness, but the Americans had built it for one reason: speed. The visored nose, combined with a full-width ramp in the tail, created a drive-on, drive-off capability. A C-5 could land at Rhine-Main Air Base in West Germany, and in less than 30 minutes, a column of M1 tanks could be driven out the front while supply trucks were being loaded in the back. Soviet transports, like the massive An-22, were loaded from a single rear ramp. They were a one-way street. The C-5 was a superhighway. The Soviets dismissed the C-5's landing gear as a maintenance nightmare. It had 28 wheels. It was impossibly complex. Why? Because the Americans had demanded a plane that could land on austere, semi-prepared airfields. It was designed to distribute its 700,000-pound weight so it wouldn't crack a runway, or worse, get stuck in the mud of a forward landing strip in a war zone. More than that, the landing gear could kneel. The entire aircraft could be lowered on its hydraulic struts until the cargo floor was at the precise height of a standard truck bed, allowing for rapid loading. This wasn't a feature, it was a weapon. It cut turnaround time by hours. And then, there was the engine. This was the true, hidden miracle. To lift such a monster, Lockheed needed a new kind of power. General Electric developed it, the TF-39. It was the world's first high-bypass turbofan. To a Soviet engineer, it looked bizarre. a massive wide fan at the front, with most of the air going around the jet's core, not through it. Their own jets were all low-bypass turbojets, thin, screaming, and brutally fuel-hungry. The TF-39 was a revolution. It was quieter. It was more reliable. But above all, it produced over 40,000 pounds of thrust, while being 25% more fuel-efficient than any military jet engine in history. This was the ingenuity that made intercontinental air bridging possible. The C-5 could fly from Dover Air Force Base in Delaware, refuel once in the air over the Atlantic, and land directly in West Germany with a full combat load. When the first C-5 Amperes, tail number 668303, rolled out of the Marietta plant in 1968, it was a creature of science fiction. It was so large that Lockheed had to build the largest aircraft factory in the world, Building B1, just to house its construction. Its internal volume was greater than a 5-story building. Its tail was as tall as a 6-story building. The Star of David insignia painted on its nose to mark the first flight crew's religion was itself 3 feet tall. The Soviets were not wrong about one thing. The C-5 was a disaster. The program was massively over budget. The complexity of the design was its Achilles heel. In 1971, the wing of a C-5 on the ground at Palmdale, California, cracked during a static test. The entire fleet was found to have a critical structural flaw. The wings were failing far short of their 30,000-hour design life. The GRU and KGB Line X analysts saw this. They read the scathing reports in Aviation Week. They heard the angry speeches from American senators. Their conclusion was simple and logical. The project was a failure. The Hangar Queen. The C-5, they confidently reported to their masters in Moscow, was a broken, over-budget symbol of capitalist decadence. It would never be a strategic threat, and with that, they stopped looking. They missed the next chapter. They missed the 1970s when Lockheed, at massive expense, began the HMOD program to redesign and rebuild the wings. They missed the late 1970s and early 1980s, when a new, quieter, and more reliable C-5B model entered production. And they completely missed the point of the annual Reforger exercises. Those phantom armies that General Lieutenant Malinsky was seeing in 1983 were not a new, secret capability. They were the result of 2 decades of American ingenuity, painful failure, and relentless engineering. The C-5 fleet, now mature and operational, was doing exactly what it had been designed to do: move 2 M1 tanks at a time in a continuous, non-stop air bridge across the Atlantic, faster than the Soviets believed was possible. The Soviets were looking for a trick. They were looking for a conspiracy. But there was no Maskirovka. The secret was the C-5 itself. The secret was that the Americans had seen the future of war, and it was a war of logistics. And they had built a monster to win it. The year was 1985. The answer to the mystery did not come from a satellite, a spy plane, or a deep-sea submarine. It came from a man walking into the American embassy in Rome, carrying a worn leather briefcase. His name was Colonel Vitaly Yurchenko, a high-ranking officer of the KGB's first chief directorate. When he defected, he brought with him a wealth of knowledge, but the most valuable item was not a list of agent names. It was a single, innocuous-looking document he had acquired from a Soviet technical intelligence agent. It was a United States Air Force manual. Technical Order 1C, 5 Amperes 9, loading and offloading. The document was flown to Washington, analyzed and disseminated. A copy eventually made its way, heavily redacted, through intelligence channels to NATO, and from there, a summary of its non-sensitive contents was intentionally leaked to a known Warsaw Pact listening post. It was a piece of carefully managed psychological warfare. The leak found its way back to Moscow, and eventually to the light table in General Lieutenant Malinsky's bunker in Rivne, the same light table that had, 2 years earlier, held the impossible photograph. This new document was not a grainy photo. It was a series of crisp, technical line drawings. And one page in particular ended the mystery forever. It was figures 6 to 11. Loading 2 M1 tanks. There it was. Not a theory, not a rumor, not a kit or an airship. It was a simple, brutal diagram. It showed the C-5 Galaxy aircraft, its visor nose open. It showed the first M1 Abrams tank, weighing 62 tons, being driven up the ramp and secured. Then, it showed the second M1 Abrams tank, another 62 tons, being driven in right behind it. 1 plane, 2 main battle tanks. Malinsky stared at the diagram. He didn't speak. The young GRU colonel, now older and more tired, stood beside him. "The engineers at Tupolev insisted it was impossible," the colonel whispered as if in a daze. "They said the floor loading, the center of gravity. They said the wings would snap off on takeoff." "They were wrong," Malinsky said. His voice was hollow. This was the shock moment. It was not a loud explosion. It was a cold, silent, sickening realization. It was the feeling of a chessboard being kicked over. Every calculation he had ever made, every war game he had ever run, every correlation of forces report he had ever sent to Moscow, all of it was worthless. All of it was based on a lie. The lie was not American deception. The lie was Soviet dogma. The lie was the comforting belief that their engineers were the best, that their assumptions were correct, that the decadent Americans were incapable of such a feat. Malinsky picked up his red pencil, the one he had used to mark his maps with such confidence. He walked over to the great map of Europe. He looked at the symbols for his glorious tank armies, poised to sweep west. Then he looked at the blue NATO symbols, the ones he had assumed would be fatally slow to reinforce. He began to do the math. The real math. The Americans had a fleet of approximately 70 operational C-5 Amperes aircraft and were beginning to field the new C-5B model. Let us be conservative, he thought. Say only 50 are mission-capable at any one time. 50 aircraft, 2 M1 tanks per aircraft. That was 1 to 100 M1 tanks. Per trip, a C-5 could make the trip from Dover, Delaware to Rhine-Main, Germany, in approximately 12 hours with one aerial refueling. Unload in 1 hour. Fly back in 11 hours. Be ready for the next load in, say, 3 hours. A full cycle in 27 hours. 100 tanks every day. In 10 days, while his own divisions were still struggling to cross a radioactive, chemically saturated battlefield, the Americans could fly in 1 to 1,000 M1 Abrams tanks. That was 3 full armored divisions. And that, he realized, was just the tanks. That didn't account for the C-141 Starlifter fleet, which would be running a parallel air bridge of ammunition, fuel, food, and the troops to man the Pomkas sites he had so foolishly dismissed. The 7-day war was a fantasy. The Red Army would not be racing to the Rhine against a handful of outnumbered German and American screening forces. They would be slamming, head-on, into a fully reinforced, fully supplied and bottomless American army that had, in effect, teleported across the ocean. "They did it," Malinsky murmured, a strange, horrifying respect in his voice. "They didn't just build a plane, they built a bridge made of air." The shock that hit Malinsky and Rivne became a tidal wave of panic in Moscow. The Politburo was furious. The marshals of the Soviet Union were humiliated. The myth of their unstoppable conventional superiority was shattered. The response was immediate. It was desperate. And it was, in its own way, a catastrophe. If the Soviets could not stop the C-5, they must match it. A high-priority directive was sent to the one place in the Soviet Union capable of such a miracle. The Antonov Design Bureau in Kiev, under the legendary designer Oleg Antonov and later Pyotr Balabuyev. The order was simple: build our C-5, build it better, and build it now. The result, which first flew in December of 1982 but was only revealed to a stunned West at the Paris Air Show in 1985, was the Antonov and 124 Ruslan. To the world, it was a triumph of Soviet engineering. And it was. It was a magnificent, awe-inspiring aircraft. But to the intelligence officers on both sides, it was a confession. The An-124 was a near-perfect admission of fear. It was a direct, panicked and slavish imitation of the C-5's core concepts. Did the C-5 have a visored upward, hinging nose for drive-on loading? Then the An-124 would have one too. Did the C-5 have a rear ramp for drive-off loading? Then the An-124 would also have a full-size aft cargo ramp. Did the C-5 have a complex multi-wheel landing gear that could kneel to truck bed height? Then the An-124's 24-wheel landing gear would also kneel. Did the C-5 use revolutionary high-bypass turbofan engines? Then the An-124 would be powered by the Lotarev D-18 tons, a massive high-bypass engine that was itself a masterpiece of Soviet industrial mimicry. The Soviet engineers, in their desperation, even overcorrected. The N-124 was bigger than the C-5. Its cargo bay was wider and taller. Its payload was a staggering 150 tons, compared to the C-5's 120. It could carry not just 2 T-72 tanks, but 3. It was on paper the most capable heavy-lift transport in the world, and it was completely, strategically, futile. The N-124 was a technical masterpiece that solved the wrong problem. The Americans' power did not come from a single aircraft, it came from a system. The Americans had a fleet of hundreds of C-141 and C-5 aircraft. The Soviets, their economy already cracking under the strain of the arms race, would only manage to build 55 and 124 aircraft. The Americans had a global network of airbases, leased and owned, across the entire planet. The Soviets had a handful of client states. The Americans had a fleet of over 700 aerial refueling tankers, KC-135 and KC-10 aircraft. This was the real, unsung secret. This tanker fleet allowed the C-5 seconds to fly fully loaded, non-stop, from the continental United States to anywhere on Earth. The Soviets had a tanker fleet of fewer than 80 modified bombers. Their air bridge was a fraction of the length of the American one. The Soviet Union had built a better cargo plane. The United States had built a global logistics empire. The N-124, for all its majesty, was a hollow titan. It was the result of a shock, and it was a futile response. It was an attempt to copy the enemy's sword, without understanding the industrial and economic system that forged it, or the global reach of the arm that wielded it. The Phantom Army mystery was solved, but the solution was more terrifying than the ghost. The solution was that the Americans had, quite simply, changed the rules of war. The true killer statistic of the C-5 Galaxy was not measured in bombs dropped or missiles fired. It was measured in time, tonnage, and the utter collapse of an enemy's war plan. The high watermark was Reforger 1986, codenamed Certain Sentinel. It was the largest and most complex of these exercises. In a period of just 10 days, the United States Air Force's Military Airlift Command, led by its C-5 and C-141 fleets, flew 250,000 troops and 50,000 tons of cargo from the United States to Europe. This was not a slow ramp-up. It was a continuous, 24-hour-a-day air bridge. During the peak of the exercise, a heavy-lift transport, a C-5 or C-141, was landing at Rhine-Main Air Base every 2 minutes. This was the final verdict. It was the materialization of General Lieutenant Malinsky's worst nightmare. The Soviets, with their entire national economy geared toward war, could not move that much, that fast, even if they had zero opposition. The Americans could do it as a peacetime drill. The C-5 Galaxy and the An-124 it spawned became the perfect symbols for the two systems that built them. This was the macro theme, the true lesson of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was a system of industrial imitation. Its centralized economy was a formidable machine for setting a national goal like matching the American nuclear arsenal or putting a man in space and achieving it through brute force allocation of resources. Its espionage services, like Line X, were brilliant at stealing Western technology, which its engineers were masters at reverse engineering and, often, improving. The T-72 tank, the MiG-25 fighter, the Tu-160 bomber, and indeed the magnificent An-124 were all testaments to this power. They were reactive, they were answers. But the C-5 was not an answer. It was a question. The American system, for all its chaos, waste, and market-driven inefficiency, was a system of innovation. The C-5 was born from a question that no Soviet general was in a position to ask: what if we could make sea power obsolete? What if we could move an entire army through the air? It was a conceptual leap, a reimagining of the very laws of geography and time. The Soviet Union saw the C-5, dismissed it as a failure, and only after realizing it worked did they panic and order their own. They reacted. The United States originated. This dynamic was the fatal, unhealable wound in the Soviet economy. They were always one step behind, and the cost of catching up was getting exponentially higher. The Americans unveiled the F-15 Eagle. The Soviets bankrupted a generation of engineers to build the Su-27 flanker. The Americans built the space shuttle. The Soviets, terrified of its non-existent military applications, poured billions they didn't have into the Buran shuttle a program that flew once and died. And the Americans fielded the C-5 Galaxy, a flawed, expensive, but strategically revolutionary air bridge. The Soviets, in a desperate panic, responded with the Un-124, a technically superior aircraft that arrived a decade too late, in numbers too small, and in service of an economy that was already a hollow shell. They had built a perfect, muscular arm, but the body of the state was dying of starvation. The Cold War, in the end, was not won by a single weapon. It was not won in a single fiery battle. It was a war of attrition. It was a 50-year contest of economic endurance, industrial capacity, and, above all, imagination. The C-5 Galaxy stands as the epilogue to that contest. It was never a secret weapon. It was perhaps the most visible, least understood weapon in the American arsenal. To the Soviets, it was a phantom, a ghost, a hangar queen, an impossibility. They saw it, but they could not believe it. Their own doctrine, their own engineering assumptions, their own rigid ideology blinded them. They were hunting for a complex, hidden maskirovka. They were looking for a trick. But the greatest trick the Americans ever pulled was telling the truth. They built a monster in plain sight, a 900,000-pound symbol of a system that could bend the rules of time and distance, a flying machine that could teleport armies. The Soviets saw this monster, and their entire worldview, their every calculation for victory, turned to dust. The phantom was real, and it was the sound of their own empire's foundation cracking, one impossible landing